So yeah, we'll kick things off with Connor, and then Connor will give Hunter an intro, and Hunter will read a piece as well. And we will have plenty of time at the end. If you do have questions for either of our readers, make sure to jot them down, drop them in the chat, all that good stuff. And yeah, we will get a chance to hear from them. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it with our first writer. Connor Southard grew up in Laramie, but he's lived all over the world since then, including Tanzania and the United Kingdom. Connor's got a knack for writing for very cool media outlets that then die impressive and depressing deaths very shortly thereafter, including Deadspin and The All. And his newsletter, which I encourage you to check out, although I think it's going on hiatus right now, but rich backlog of sort of speculation on what it means to write fiction, and sort of other other stuff he's reading. It's a fantastic resource. Connor I've been in workshop with Connor now for a couple of years, and what I love about Connor's fiction, he's got a knack for sort of animating the space between perception and emotion in his characters and his pieces, which I think is a really enormously difficult thing to get at, and he does it really, really well. He's a really fantastic and generous reader and editor, especially. A lot of us are sort of, we're the naive school children headed into our first longer projects, and Connor's the grizzled veteran who's been through hell and back on a number of them. So he's wonderfully supportive and very insightful with his advice. And last but not least, in what has been called a sweaty book nerd version of basketball, Connor still hits a very mean jumper despite claiming his best pickup days are behind him. So yeah, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Connor. Take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Sam. That was really kind of you. I really appreciate that you didn't mention that I went like 1 for 15 in jumpers last time we played. It'll even out eventually, but I really appreciate that. That was super kind. And I want to thank everyone for coming. I know it's always weird to do these via Zoom. I wish we were at the VFW right now, but Sam's done an amazing job both Sams have done an amazing job keeping this going. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to doing this. And I guess I'm going to dive right in here. This is probably my favorite short story that I've written in the program. Mostly I've been working on longer fiction, but this one, I won't introduce it too much. It's kind of weird. It's called Cobalt Blue, and I'm not going to get all the way through it, sadly, but might as well just jump in. When the storms return, the copy of Cold Comfort Farm that I placed on Cobalt Blue's abdomen will wash away. I feel sad when I foresee this loss, but I leave the book alone. I arranged Cobalt Blue's arms around Cold Comfort Farm as if she's clutching it to her stomach. It was one of her most beloved books, one she clutched often in life. I wish I had thought to ask her which book was truly her favorite, but this one will have to do. Cobalt Blue and I often discussed whether we might stop the storms from flooding the atrium. We never had the right tools. We had a sense of what needed to be done because we had learned to read books. Cobalt Blue taught me how to read, though mostly she read aloud to me, by the light of the solar candle that illuminated the blue of her arm and let us feel that we were surrounded by colors hidden only by the dark. We wanted to bring the fantasies we had read into being. There was a time when this felt possible. Now that Cobalt Blue is dead, I have given up on fighting the storms. In the twilight, I sit on a ledge just beyond Cobalt Blue's corpse. She rests on the Lockheed Martin trunk, which I pushed into the center of the atrium, almost snapping my spindly legs. Here, the sunlight can illuminate Cobalt Blue on the rare bright days. I watch the sunset over the gravel humps to the west, just beyond a sliver of water in what was once the estuary. I do this every night, and nothing interrupts me. The two most intense colors I have ever seen are the blue of Cobalt Blue's arm and the pink of the sunset. We haven't had a true storm since Cobalt Blue died. I haven't had a true storm. I should be better at being alone. It's just like it was before, when I didn't know how to read, before I had words, when the only thing I understood was the body of a snail. Cobalt blue, do you think the owl will ever return? I say. Nothing. You're right, why would it? There's no food here, not even snails. Nothing. Do you think we'll meet again, Cobalt blue? Nothing. One of the stories we read together was about a place called heaven. In the story, a group of angels try to escape from heaven and they succeed. We stopped reading after that because Cobalt blue became enraptured by a book called Runaway Horses, but I kept contemplating heaven. It sounded like no place I'd ever seen, but that only made it all the more like every place in the books. I had never seen a place like Middlemarch or Sevastopol or West Egg or the Straits of Salamis or Macondo either. What made heaven special was that, according to Cobalt blue at least, none of the humans had ever seen it. For once, their ignorance was like ours, alleviated only by what they could make themselves imagine with whatever circuitry they hid behind their soft flesh. Angels to them were what humans are to us. Cobalt blue said the humans learned about heaven and angels by reading a book, and then wrote more books about what they had discovered in this book. Learning this made me want to write my own book, something Cobalt blue said we could try one day. We began by scrawling crude narratives on the concrete of the atrium, using crumbly black rocks we found at the edge of the estuary. Our tales were flat, static, but it was my favorite thing to do when she was alive. If there is a heaven, that's all I want to do there, write a story with Cobalt blue. Tonight, the wind coming in across the dead estuary is sharply cold, a vestige of what was once called the changing of the seasons. I feel it, or I believe I feel it. Feel is the word Cobalt blue taught me to use. I detect it, am aware the wind is coming and that it is cold. If I had the power of smell, I might detect more details about the wind, though I suspect it would smell the same as ever, and thus carry the scent of nothing, the nothing of gravel and evaporating water. In truth, I want to write the cold off as nothing as well as just another scrap of story. Without Cobalt blue or anyone else to speak with, I doubt my own feelings. They may only be pieces of narration, beliefs I can encode in language, just like my belief that Cobalt blue still exists in some way. It's getting cold, Cobalt blue. Nothing. The wind sounds like a cry of anguish. The closest thing to a cry of anguish I've ever heard was Cobalt blue's choking in her final days, or the sounds coming from my mouth, which is badly suited to the purpose it must serve. My first memory is not of Cobalt blue. It's of an infinitely unfurling tapestry of dirt, gravel, and the occasional snail. When I scroll over part of the tapestry, what I scanned just before refurls itself and unfurls again later, maybe not that far beyond the horizon, which I could never see because I never lift my gaze from the ground. I don't know how long I crawled along the ground searching for snails. When I found one that was the right species, it would look the same to Cobalt blue as most other snails, but I knew, in a way that went beyond sensory processing, I would eat it. Cobalt blue believed I did this for around 10 years before we met. I want to believe her, but I think she was trying to make me feel better. I suspect I was doing it for much, much longer than 10 years. The tapestry may have taken centuries to weave. Sometimes I would clamber over ruins. They were similar enough to the usual gravel and dirt, and the occasional slime, fungus, algae, mud, even straggling grass, that they never registered as anything other than angular rocks. It was only with Cobalt blue's help that I remembered the ruins, and this process might have been more of a reimagining. In any case, I never gave a thought to humans before I met Cobalt blue. There were snails. I do remember arriving at the atrium. Because I had grown so used to disregarding the horizon, I didn't detect the looming concrete wall until I hit my head against it. At the time, I didn't regard the sensation as pain, but it knocked me backwards and disrupted my search for snails. It registered as a problem, an unfamiliar one. I rallied all of my sensory and analytic processes in order to shape the atrium into another stitch on my tapestry. When I entered through what Cobalt blue and I would come to regard as the front door, however, I could not harness my own processes with the usual rigor and alacrity. I was distant from the snails, withdrawing from the tapestry. This was not a feeling so much as the encroaching shadow of a feeling. Perhaps the collision broke something in me. I've often wanted to slice open my skull in order to understand what was happening. Mostly what I felt was what I would come to regard as fatigue. I collapsed on the cracked concrete of the atrium's floor just inside the door. Through the gaps in the roof beams, I for the first time considered stars. The night sky was free of snails. In the morning, I woke up. I don't remember sleeping before that night. There's no reason I couldn't have crumpled into blackness while on my search for snails, yet that would have left the tapestry exactly as it was before, with only a disjunction in the light by which I searched. Now time was beginning to spill itself over my tapestry. If the next day had not yielded tools for guiding time, making it fit patterns, I might have succumbed to a primitive simulacrum of madness. I might have harnessed my processes to guide my body over a cliff. Instead of dutifully crawling to my doom, I stood and regarded the glaring landscape beyond the door. I had covered all the ground I could now see, but it was as if I was sensing it for the first time. Standing was helping. I had stood before to survey complex terrain. What I saw before me had an unfamiliar complexity, textures I had not processed because they had nothing to do with the search for snails. All of a sudden, the horizon existed, jagged in places, undulating in others, hazed over with dust. And then the horizon rippled with darkness. It was the first time I had seen fabric, a roiling ribbon interrupting the sky. Beneath and within the ribbon, solid and shining, a body that triggered every alarm process within me. Processes I didn't know I had, as I had never encountered anything more dangerous than a distant rock slide. The body was so big. Cobalt Blue saw me and staggered, dropped to her knee. Her cloak billowed over the ground. I scuttled into the atrium, making sounds much like the one I make in this twilight. In some of the stories I read with Cobalt Blue, a character is so haunted by death that they almost become a ghost themselves. Wuthering Heights was one of Cobalt Blue's favorites. She always asserted that she was Heathcliff. She was intense, she said, and grandiose, and destructively romantic. We agreed that I was probably Joseph, the stern and religious servant, although I did not practice the Christian faith. Cobalt Blue pointed to my loyalty and my fascination with heaven. I never countered with what I wanted to say, which was that Joseph was cold, even cruel, the things I least wanted to be. He was also a servant, but that I could accept. Now Cobalt Blue is Kathy. I don't think even she would deny the parallels. The yearned after corpse, almost more compelling in death than in life, certainly easier to get along with. I don't really believe this last part, but it's the kind of witticism I taught myself to make, because it pleased Cobalt Blue when I attempted jokes, no matter how clumsy. A man named Ralph Waldo Emerson became so fixated on his dead wife that, much like Heathcliff, he would dig up her coffin and look at her body, even as she decayed beyond recognition. Apparently, this was something humans did. They wanted grief and horror and love to meld into one another. It makes perfect sense to me. I have no desire to part from Cobalt Blue's body. I don't know if she will ever decay. So little of either of us could be called organic. I have not observed any signs of outward decay, although something must have gone wrong inside her, or she would not have died. During the day, I sit with Cobalt Blue. Time flattens into a shape like the tapestry of my before days, yet without even its snail bump texture. I have no purpose, so the days now are as smooth and featureless as the white sheets the characters in our books would carefully wash and hang to dry. I wish I could call sitting with Cobalt Blue a purpose, but she would have not have dignified such sentimentality. She believed our task was to find a purpose, however slow the search. If she had lived, we might have one day discovered a reason to leave this place. Today, the light is close to its norm. I have infinitesimally granular sensors that work with my processes to grade the light. I could record, if I wanted, the slight variations in light intensity between nanoseconds and specific square millimeters of the atrium's floor. I could record the way starlight from a specific cluster in the night sky interacts with the purpley oxidized metal of the half-collapsed roof. I could record the gradations of blue undulating over Cobalt Blue's dead arm. None of this would lend itself to language, which is the medium I prefer, since it's Cobalt Blue's enduring gift to me. It's best to say that the day is gray, and that this gray signals nothing but a continuation of the gray that came before. Would you like me to place a different book on your abdomen, Cobalt Blue? Nothing. Perhaps Far from the Madding Crowd? Nothing. It's pastoral and ultimately comic, similar to Cold Comfort Farm, the one you're now clutching. I could switch them if you like. Nothing. The other books are inside the Lockheed Martin trunk on which Cobalt Blue rests. I entombed them beneath her because I didn't want to read them without her. Accessing them would require moving her body, which I could physically do, but would find emotionally arduous. So I haven't read anything else since Cobalt Blue died. I have tried to revive Cobalt Blue. I wrote incantations on the concrete floor around her body in English, the only language either of us ever had a chance to read, and in languages I inferred from the deep structures of English, my ghostly imitations of Latin, French, Greek. The incantations were boldly inscribed, the letters capital and sharply edged, radiating out from the Lockheed Martin trunk. 2 nights ago, I broke a Yeats poem into spokes and arrayed the lines around her. Then I climbed to the roof beams of the atrium and looked down at her body, at the incantatory poetry. My soul, I summoned to the winding ancient stair. Set all your mind upon the steep ascent, upon the broken, crumbling battlement, upon the breathless starlit air, upon the star that marks the hidden pole. Fix every wandering thought upon that quarter where all thought is done. Who can distinguish darkness from the soul? These lines and the rest of the poem tendrilled outward from her body. I was pleased that I could read my own writing from this height without extending my optics. I felt certain that Cobalt Blue would call the sight beautiful. Her folded blue arm was the only color interrupting the grayscale word drawing. The daylight almost imperceptibly brighter than usual, sharpening the lattice of shadow over her body in the poem. Wind rustled her cloak. Night fell and I climbed down. Beauty had not brought her back to life. I wiped away the incantations one by one. Now the only words written around Cobalt Blue's body are the lines of this story, inscribed in crumbly black rock I found down by the dead estuary, the one I'm hoping you'll find, or wish you had found if the storm washes it away but leaves a trace of Cobalt Blue in myself. Maybe you'll wonder whether we understood the books in the Lockheed Martin chest. For a long time after her arrival, Cobalt Blue huddled in a corner of the atrium. I hid from her. Neither of us moved much. We were both tracking one another using infrared and other processes, devoting so much of ourselves to the task of isolation and rejection. I could see the heat of her through the concrete, pulsating in the southwest corner, near the biggest gap facing onto the spent estuary. I surmised that she spent much of the day watching the estuary, as if the slime and muck and deposited salt would yield revelation if she waited long enough. Once I grew bold enough, in the nighttime, I would peek around whatever ruined pylon or pile of rubble behind which I had secreted myself and watch Cobalt Blue. Her solar candle flickered all night long, illuminating her round face, though most of it would be hidden by the shadows of her cloak. In reconstructing these days and nights, the main question I have for my pre-linguistic self is this: why didn't I set off in pursuit of snails? Damage sustained in the collision is one answer. Another is that I was already compelled by Cobalt Blue. But that feels too poetic. The characters in our books were forever deluding themselves about the power someone else's presence had over them. I don't trust memory to mediate my feelings, and my feelings are themselves an approximation of emotion, existing more in inherited language than a physical fact. It would be arrogant to say that I truly feel, even worse to claim that I felt before I had words. What I can say is that one night I scuttled toward Cobalt Blue. The solar candle illuminated the hood of her cloak, which she had pulled down over her face. My legs carried me toward her without a conscious decision. Some process in me impelled me forward, some distaff cousin of desire. I stopped a few meters short of Cobalt Blue and stood. As if only sensing me now that I had raised my body, Cobalt Blue sluggishly pulled away her hood, indented white of her face, broken only by the gleaming glassy black of her eyes, so similar to mine. "It's the ghost of the atrium," she said. My body shuddered. Somehow I understood the outlines of what she was saying. Inside me were processes that recognized language, and yet this was the first time I'd ever encountered words. "Have you come to haunt me, ghost?" she said. Cobalt Blue stood. Her body creaked and whined. I scuttled backwards. Cobalt Blue was much bigger, much faster. She clutched my head and pulled me into the air. I dangled from her palm, her steel claws compressing my skull. I made sounds akin to a squeal and waved my limbs. "No," Cobalt Blue said. "You're no ghost. You're just another fucking robot like me." Cobalt Blue put me down. With my legs under me, my first impulse was to scuttle away. Yet I resisted my processes. I wanted to form words now that I had discovered they were within me. "Are you me?" I said. My voice was raspy where hers was mellifluous. yet she recognized the words. What a silly question, she said. But I have to admit, it's hard for beings like us to form a sense of self. I suppose I asked that same question once. Whom did you ask? I said. I knew some words, though I barely understood them as they left my mouth. It was as if a process never before triggered had begun to work inside me. Cobalt Blue laughed. I discovered that this too was a legible signal. No one. I'm Cobalt Blue, by the way. With her right claw, she tapped the plump plastic of her left arm. I had noticed its rich color before, but I didn't yet have a word for it. Down the side, in blocky script, the blue plastic read, Cobalt Blue. Where did you come from, little ghost? She said. Nowhere, I said. Cobalt Blue turned and settled back into her corner. Her hood was now thrown back. I scuttled toward her. That can't be true, she said. You have a long night ahead of us. Try to tell me where you came from. Snails, I said. Okay, so that's at the end of the story, but I'm out of time, and it's time for me to intro Hunter, I believe, right, Sam?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. Okay, so I'm introducing my buddy, Hunter Pauli, who, we've had some adventures together in my time in Montana. Let's just leave it at that. But more importantly, Hunter is a Missoula-based investigative reporter from Seattle. He graduated from the University of Montana Journalism School. He spent the last 10 years here in Montana doing reporting on the drug war, far-right politics, and the oil industry, particularly the Keystone XL pipeline. His reporting has appeared in almost every paper in Montana, as well as papers in Washington, Wyoming, and Idaho, and national publications such as Rolling Stone and The Guardian. He's a two-time winner of the Montana Newspaper Association's Top Investigative Reporting Award, and has won many other writing awards from the MNA, the Society of Professional Journalists, and Hearst. And I just want to throw in here that it's not in his official bio, but I've known a lot of journalists, and I don't know if I know any of them who are as principled and as dogged in investigative work as Hunter is. So I'll throw it over to him.
Wow, cringe, Connor. Thank you so much for that introduction. Today, I'm going to be reading a feature that I wrote for the Montana Free Press back in 2018 about Keystone XL pipeline. It was my first kind of large-scale investigation of the pipeline, and I was able to get funding to head over to Fort Peck in Northeast Montana for a week to report, do interviews, get information, travel around. I had a photographer colleague and a videographer with me. I'm going to actually drop a link to the story in the chat here so that you can take a look at some of these photos that we have in here, because they're very good. And they really help illustrate the point, because it is a very arresting environment. And you can follow around there if you'd like. I'm going to be reading from this hard copy edition of the Missoula Independent. May it rest in peace. This is actually the second to last cover story that the Indy had before they were shut down on September 11th, 2018 by Lee Enterprises after the staff unionized. The way I got involved with Keystone XL was through the contacts I made through the University of Montana's native news reporting course. I had sources over there who hit me up after the pipeline project was brought back. Nobody else was reporting on it. I started doing it, and I've been doing it ever since. And yeah, at the end of this story here, I will give a little update on the status of the pipeline now, because a lot of things have changed over the years. And yeah, here we go. Lance Four-Star drives west at 70 miles per hour using his knees to work the steering wheel as he watches Montana Senator John Tester's Indian Country Facebook town hall on his wife's smartphone. The video starting and stopping as a cellular signal goes in and out on the 40-mile drive from the middle of the Fort Peck Indian Reservation to its border. There aren't many jobs on this 2 million acre reservation in Montana's northeast corner. Four-Star is brushing up on Tester's policy positions before an interview for a job on the Democrats' re-election campaign, which is in its last 100 days. As a U.S. Army veteran, Four-Star supports Tester's work reforming the Department of Veterans Affairs, but disagrees with Tester on one major issue. Quote, "Will you stop the pipelines from entering Montana?" Four-Star reads aloud from the comment section of the Facebook stream. The phone loses signal again before 4-star can see if the question is answered, but the senator's position is no mystery. Just like every other top politician in the state, Democrat and Republican, state and federal, Tester supports construction of the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, which is slated to cross the Missouri River a quarter-mile upriver the Fort Peck's southwestern border when construction begins next year. We're just outnumbered and outmoneyed, 4-star says, guiding his Ford F-150 along U.S. Route 2 as it parallels the bulbous petroleum trains regularly traversing the BNSF rail line. The tanker convoys arrive empty at the Bakken oil patch just to the east, and the Yellowbird tar sands far to the north, and leave full for refineries and export terminals. 4-star fears that if any of the trains rolling through the tribal seat of Poplar, or the reservation's largest town of Wolf Point, ever derailed, it could blow up the entire town, a point pipeline supporters also make. But to 4-star, the Keystone XL pipeline is no less threatening to his community than crude oil traveling by train. 4-star is the chairman of the Fort Peck Assiniboine Council, which is separate from and predates the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux Tribal Executive Board that is recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as the reservation's elected governing body. Fort Peck is a 2-tribe reservation, and the Sioux also have a non-governing council. Canadian Pipeline Company TransCanada plans for Keystone XL to cross beneath the riverbed of the Missouri River about a quarter-mile upstream of the confluence with the Milk River, the reservation's southwestern border. 2 miles upriver of the proposed crossing site is the mile-long spillway of the Fort Peck Dam. The spillway itself functions as a safety valve to rapidly release water from the 5th largest reservoir in America when it gets dangerously high. 70 miles downriver on the reservation is the intake plant for the Assiniboine and Sioux Rural Water Supply System, a $300 million congressionally mandated drinking water treatment and supply network built after oil drilling turned much of the tribe's aquifer north of Poplar saline and carcinogenic. 2 agricultural water intakes are further upriver between the intake and the proposed pipeline. The big concern for local pipeline opponents like 4-star is a doomsday scenario in which a heavy snowpack and spring rains fill the reservoir to its capacity, which could mandate a huge release of water from the dam to prevent it from falling. That torrent of water flowing out of the spillway would scour the riverbed downstream, and that scouring could damage or rupture the pipeline, releasing diluted tar sands bitumen into the river. In 2010, a pipeline owned by Canadian Pipeline Company Enbridge spilled more than 1 million gallons of tar sands crude into the Kalamazoo River in Kalamazoo, Michigan. A National Transportation Safety Board investigation of that incident found that diluted bitumen breaks down into its constituent chemicals, including benzene, a known carcinogenic, when spilled into a river. If a spill like that were to happen in the Missouri River, those toxic chemicals could be sucked into Fort Peck Water Network's intake, which could wreck the system, require an emergency shutoff, or poison the tribe's drinking water a second time. The 2013 letter to the State Department reviewing the draft environmental impact statement for Keystone XL, the EPA Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance referenced the dangers exposed by the Kalamazoo diluted bitumen spill, particularly benzene, and recommended that the EIS environmental impact statement reflect the additional risks present in diluted bitumen spills. The fear that such a spill could result from a massive release of water from the reservoir isn't unfounded. Such a release happened in 2011 during record high runoff and caused more than $200 million in damages to the spillway. TransCanada has repeatedly said the proposed 36-inch pipeline will be state-of-the-art and will never break, but the company hasn't convinced the plaintiffs suing the U.S. State Department and Interior in Great Falls, Missouri River Courthouse more than 300 miles upstream. 4-star speaks of when the pipeline breaks, not if. Unless you take the pipeline out, at some point, it's going to erode. It will leak, he says. It's easy to think, in a geological timescale, in the traditional Assiniboine wintering grounds, where the floodplains meet the highland valleys where Tyrannosaurus once roamed, now submerged beneath the reservoir. This section of the Missouri runs clear and clean, visibly teeming with waterfowl and fish, including, not so visibly, some of the last remaining pallid sturgeon, living fossils that survived the meteors that wiped out the dinosaurs, only to face the threat of extinction from the dams destroying their habitat. The remote Montana portion of the Keystone XL pipeline hasn't attracted the attention aimed at the Nebraska section or other proposed pipelines, including Enbridge's Line 3 in Minnesota, the Bayou Bridge pipeline in Louisiana, or the Trans Mountain pipeline in Western Canada. Data analysis by the Washington Post in February found that 3 towns on or adjacent to the reservation, Glasgow, Scobie, and Wolf Point, are the first, second, and third most remote small towns in America. Just to the south, Circle is the farthest town in the nation from a Starbucks. Up here in northeast Montana, we're the farthest from everything, and I like that, 4-star says. Leaving the reservation, 4-star weaves his truck between road crews widening the main thoroughfare of the no stoplight town of Nashua from 2 lanes to 4, twice the width of the Highline's US Route 2. The road, Montana Highway 117, is patrolled by pilot cars guiding convoys around graders and excavators. A new bridge is being built over the railway to connect US 2 to Highway 117, which continues south toward the Missouri River. A few miles south of Nashua, 4-Star turns off Highway 117 into a network of farm roads, passing the New Deal boom towns turned ghost towns that once housed the workers who built the Fort Peck Dam during the Great Depression. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the earthen dam, the largest ever built at the time, and second largest today, as a solution to unemployment as much as a tool for flood control and power generation. The Fort Peck Dam isn't a sheer concrete cliff like stereotypical dams. It's essentially a 250-foot high pile of dirt about 2 miles long and half a mile wide. FDR said here 84 years ago that the style probably took more manpower and labor hours than other dam designs, which was the point, since one of the primary purposes for building it was to put people to work. TransCanada has promised the pipeline will bring jobs for locals, but 4-Star doesn't believe the company. Standing on the riverbank where the Keystone XL pipeline is due to cross beneath Missouri, 4-Star examines photos of recently released TransCanada maps shared by a member of the Tribal Executive Board. This isn't the first oil pipeline crossing site 4-Star has been to or opposed. He traveled in 2016 to the Standing Rock demonstrations against the Dakota Access Pipeline as part of a veterans contingent. That was the second time 4-Star was gassed by the government, he says. The first time was in the Army chemical warfare training. 4-Star says he took an oath when he enlisted in the Army to defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that Keystone XL fits that bill. Keystone XL doesn't threaten just living members of the tribe, but also burial grounds to the west of the reservation, as well as teepee rings and other sacred archaeological sites, he says. For 4-Star, it's the equivalent of building a pipeline through the Vatican. We're not in the way of the pipeline isn't in the way of us, he says. 6 miles up the Missouri from the Milk River confluence is Kirkland Ranch Estates, a planned housing development of 91 residential plots, 3 commercial plots, and a golf course. All that's been built so far are roads. 4-Star says it's rumored the houses won't go in, and instead the land will be the site of a man camp to house the workers who will build Keystone XL. Jed Kirkland, the property developer, says that's not true. Kirkland says the man camp will be located a little more than a mile north on 117 on the northern side of its intersection with MDU Road, which he knows because he helped TransCanada install the water line to that property. Kirkland says he doesn't know whether the man camp will be good or bad for Kirkland Ranch Estates. In 2008, skyrocketing oil prices spurred a fracking boom in the Bakken Formation on Fort Peck's eastern border that saw tens of thousands of workers, mostly single men, housed in hastily constructed trailer towns. Fueled by long hours, high wages, and nothing but prairie in every direction, man camps became centers for drugs and sexual violence, which have affected Native women in disproportionately high numbers. 4-Star says meth didn't get really bad on the reservation until that neighboring boom. TransCanada says the workers coming in are of a different breed, 4-Star says, drug tested and with families. He doesn't believe them. They also say the tar sands float, he says, repeating a common joke among Keystone XL opponents. 4-Star is suspicious of any promises of safety from oil companies after the Kalamazoo pipeline spill. While the oil traveling from the Bakken is light, sweet crude easily pumped from wells and through pipelines, the tar sands derived crude of northern Alberta that Keystone XL carry is viscous. Before tar sands crude can be pumped through a pipeline, first has to be clawed out of cliff walls with bucket excavators, then heated to extract the heavy oil known as bitumen. Bitumen is too thick to be pumped through a pipeline, so it has to be mixed with other hydrocarbons to thin it out, producing diluted bitumen. TransCanada says that if Keystone XL ruptured, diluted bitumen would simply float away on the Missouri, bypassing the underwater intakes of the tribe's water system. The plaintiffs suing the feds over Keystone XL's environmental impact statement allege that the company's claim is based on an oil spill model tailored to conventional crude oil, not tar sands crude. In comments on a draft environmental impact statement in 2013, TransCanada briefly contradicts its own public stance that diluted bitumen floats. Quote, if oil does remain on the water surface for a sufficient time without being cleaned up, there is potential for some oil to sink, TransCanada wrote. Unlike in laboratory settings, when diluted bitumen spilled in Kalamazoo, its components separated and the bitumen sank to the riverbed. That's why 4-Star is worried when TransCanada says the main camps aren't a threat to the reservation. According to a confidential email from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Chief of Law Enforcement David Loven to FWP wardens and leadership, Nashua won't be the only man camp. Loven says man camps are also expected to appear in the towns of Circle, 50 miles south of Missouri, 50 miles up the up the Milk River in Hinsdale and more than 100 miles to the southeast in Baker, where an oil on-ramp will be built for Bakken Oil. TransCanada says the Hinsdale camp alone is expected to house 800 workers. Although man camps bring a certain degree of law enforcement challenges, the primary enforcement focus is protest activity, Lowen said in the email. The email was released to the Montana ACLU as part of a campaign of statewide public disclosure requests the organization hopes will map police surveillance of Native American environmentalists ahead of an anticipated Standing Rock style protest against the pipeline. Angeline Cheek is a Fort Peck tribal member who went to Standing Rock in the fall of 2016 and an activist with Indian People's Action, a Montana-based indigenous rights group that has previously organized blockades against convoys hauling tar sands equipment through the state to Alberta. Angeline says drugs and sexual violence have been a problem on the reservation for a long time, but that she doesn't remember things being nearly this bad growing up. She says a couple of her cousins are addicted to meth, which she says flows onto the reservation from the Bakken oil field main camps, alongside sexually transmitted diseases and human trafficking. For more than a year, anti-pipeline activists have marched from one end of the reservation to the other to raise awareness of the threat Keystone XL poses to the network from which most of the surrounding off-reservation communities also get their drinking water. Last April, a 60-mile march was held on Montana Highway 13 from the Canadian border north of the reservation south to the Missouri River. The first community the marchers passed through is the predominantly white town of Scobie, which sits in the middle of a 25-mile strip of farm ranch land between Canada and the Fort Peck Reservation. Even with ACLU observers present, by all accounts, the atmosphere was tense. Sheik says that just south of the Canadian border, marchers encountered gun-holding farmers who followed the marchers to Scobie in their cars. Sheik says she and another marcher lagged behind in town, handing out flyers, and were surrounded by locals shouting threats. "Go Trump, let the pipeline through, let's scalp and kill all these Indians," Sheik said they yelled. That really scared me. She and the other marchers jumped into one of the march's support vehicles and caught up with the other activists south of town. As the march continued, Cheek and Fourstar say they were shadowed and circled by truck-driving locals who heckled the marchers whenever they stopped for prayers at water crossings. Cheek said the hecklers followed the march 9 miles onto the reservation before turning back. She says she saw full gun racks on the trucks through her windows. ACLU Legal Director Alex Raitt confirmed the aggressive comments, but could not confirm the presence of guns. This reservation is a concentration camp, and now we're going to be surrounded by man camps. It's like being surrounded by the KKK, Cheek says. Cheek says the tribal government hasn't prepared for the violence the pipeline construction could bring to the reservation if the pipeline isn't stopped by the lawsuit in Great Falls. Although the Fort Peck Executive Board has passed a resolution in 2015 opposing Keystone XL, the tribes are not party to the lawsuit opposing the pipeline. Instead, for the past year, they've attempted to negotiate with TransCanada to reroute the pipeline. Protesters have scared off TransCanada representatives from public meetings with the Executive Board, which has led to closed meetings, giving ammunition to activists who accuse the tribal government of collaborating with the pipeline company. According to public notices that TransCanada published in Eastern Montana newspapers in 2008, 2 other routes were proposed downstream of Fort Peck's water intake. One would have crossed the reservation, with the other cutting east above the reservation's northern border before turning south, quote, avoiding BIA lands, as a 2009 TransCanada document stated. TransCanada finally chose the shortest route, the pipeline's current path, which crosses the Missouri below the Fort Peck Dam spillway and upriver of the water intake. It is unlikely that TransCanada could easily change the route, even if the company wanted to. When the Nebraska Public Service Commission denied TransCanada's preferred pipeline route through the state's western sandhills last December, plaintiffs latched onto the fact that the alternative route the Nebraska PSC approved hadn't been studied in the EIS approved by the feds. On July 30th, the State Department released a draft environmental impact statement of the current Nebraska route that forecasts a negligible environmental impact. On August 15th, Judge Brian Morris ruled the draft assessment wasn't enough, that the State Department must file a supplemental EIS that considers the new Nebraska portion of the route, which the 2014 EIS did not cover. Morris is yet to rule on the wider aspects of the case against Keystone XL. Referenced in the Nebraska draft assessment was an unattached TransCanada risk assessment of the pipeline's Missouri River crossing site near Fort Peck that the company submitted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the agency in charge of granting river crossing permits. While publication of the federal government's Nebraska assessment was announced in the Federal Register and posted to the State Department's Keystone XL website, TransCanada's Missouri River risk assessment was published exclusively on the pipeline company's website sometime in July with no announcement. That's a document that Fort Peck tribes have been searching for a long time. I don't think this is worth the paper it's written on, Fort Peck Executive Board Chairman Floyd Azor says, throwing the 111-page risk assessment down onto his desk in the sprawling tribal government complex on the outskirts of Poplar. Risk assessment is dated July 31st, 2017. Azur says the tribes have been asking TransCanada to see it for more than a year. Azur says the company refused to provide the document, saying that doing so would violate federal law. TransCanada did not respond to multiple requests for an interview regarding Keystone XL. Azur says the tribes finally received a copy on July 27th this year, nearly a year after the assessment was written, from Governor Steve Bullock's office. Rania Abel, a spokesperson for Bullock's office, told Montana Free Press in an email that she downloaded the document from TransCanada's Keystone XL website after it was recently posted. The plaintiffs, suing to stop the pipeline, didn't have a copy until August 7th, when MTFP sent it to them. Azur is furious because despite years of public comment, court testimony, letters to state and federal governments, protests, news reporting, and even a personal letter to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the risk assessment makes no mention of Fort Peck's water network, the reservation, or the tribes. I've just got no confidence in this point, Azur says. We're basically an afterthought. The Fort Peck tribes have treaty rights to the water of the Missouri River, the center of which constitutes the reservation's southern border. Azur says the tribes should have been consulted for the risk assessment, considering that they're the ones at risk, and that the state and the Bureau of Indian Affairs should have told TransCanada to talk with the tribal government. There's a spill, it's going to be on our land, and it's going to be in our water, Azur says, motioning to his coffee mug, and it doesn't float. Azur says that if the pipeline is built, there will be a Standing Rock style protest in northeast Montana. He says he doesn't want to see that, but because the pipeline doesn't touch tribal land, he's powerless to stop construction, making protests inevitable. He says the only way to stop a mass protest is a legal injunction on pipeline construction, as the plaintiffs in the federal lawsuit Upriver and Great Falls are seeking. I'm pushing for a lawsuit. I want it, and I want those guys in the tribal executive board to go along with it, he says. Azur says that even without disruptive anti-pipeline troublemakers, his words, president meetings with TransCanada, it quickly became apparent there would be no concessions, such as routing the pipeline downriver of the water network intake. It wasn't a negotiation. They just told us what they were going to do, he said. Finally getting the risk assessment last month and seeing that it didn't mention the risk to the tribes was the last straw for Azur. He says he plans to ask the executive board to vote on joining the federal lawsuit to stop the pipeline, though it's unclear whether that's possible, considering that oral arguments have been made and the parties are awaiting Morris's ruling. Azur says he also wants to sue TransCanada for negligence. Fort Peck Dam operations manager Darren McMurray watches two fishermen in a walleye boat in a bay carved into the Bear Paw Shale at the bottom of the dam's mile-long spillway. Compared to the shale, which formed millions of years ago and crumbles like sand despite looking like rock, the bay is young. It formed in 2011 when a heavy snowpack in the Rockies melted and combined with record spring rains behind the dam. To prevent a catastrophic domino collapse of the 6 Missouri River main stem dams holding back the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 11th largest reservations in America, which could have cleaved the nation in two with cataclysmic flooding, the Army Corps of Engineer decision makers who run the dams from their base in Omaha, Nebraska, opened the spillways. The Fort Peck Dam spillway maxed out in 2011 at 52,000 cubic feet of water per second rushing through its 16 fully open gates. McMurray said the floodwaters accelerated to 45 miles per hour, rushing down the concrete spillway, crashed into the riverbed 225 feet below, and carved out the bay, nearly undermining the entire structure, which required tens of millions of dollars in repair. I don't want to have a year like that again, McMurray says. He doesn't want to, but he probably will. As of August 1st, the spillway was open and expelling a relative trickle of 5,000 cubic feet of water per second, which crashes into a new concrete extension on the sides and bottom of the spillway lip, preventing the bay from growing. It's only the 6th time the dam's 78-year operating history that the spillway has been opened, the first being in 1975, which set the previous record release of 35,000 cubic feet per second. McMurray has seen half of those openings since he began working at the dam in the 1990s. In addition to carving out the bay at the bottom of the spillway, the 2011 floodwaters scoured the riverbed downstream, though McMurray says the Corps doesn't know the full extent. A recently released TransCanada analysis of the spillway's scouring threat to the pipeline states that even if the spillway released at its maximum output of 350,000 CFS, the flow would still only scour 21.7 feet down into the riverbed, with the pipeline still safe at 53 feet below the riverbed. In the case of such flooding, the analysis says, quote, the devastation will be immense on or near the floodplain for the entire length of the river. However, the design of the pipeline valves would withstand the potential inundation and flows of such massive flood events. Pipeline opponents have yet to weigh in on TransCanada's conclusions, but are skeptical of studies paid for by oil companies that determine oil projects to be safe, such as lab results showing that tar sands bitumen floats. McMurray says the spillway's maximum output is 230,000 CPS. We cannot speak to where TransCanada got the 350,000 figure. There's precedent in Montana for river scouring breaking oil pipelines, which TransCanada says is why the government plans to bury Keystone XL so deep. To bury Keystone XL so deep. River scouring from the 2011 flood broke an oil pipeline located only a few feet beneath the Yellowstone River, which Keystone XL must also cross, spilling 63,000 gallons of crude. Like the Missouri River crossing risk assessment, the scouring analysis doesn't mention the tribes, the reservation, or the threat the pipeline spill poses to the drinking water network. If that spill ever happens, they say we've got a day or two before it hits us, says Sandra White Eagle, program director of the Assiniboine and Sioux Rural Water Supply System. But we figure we've got about a couple hours, she says. White Eagle says it takes 7 to 12 minutes for water to travel from the intake on the Missouri River to the water treatment plant at the intersection of US Route 2 and Montana Highway 13 between Wolf Point and Poplar. White Eagle says she's always wanted to run her own water treatment plant, having completed a wastewater treatment program at Montana State University Northern, worked at plants in Great Falls and Chinook. When she applied for a similar job at Wolf Point, she says the bosses said she was qualified, but that we're really looking for a male. White Eagle, who worked 20 years for the Fort Peck Office of Environmental Protections, says she worked to get the reservation up to EPA water quality standards. She ran a boat collecting river samples beneath cottonwood trees old enough to have seen by Lewis and Clark when they camped just downriver from Keystone XL's proposed crossing site. She was promoted earlier this year to run the water network. The $300 million water network was mandated by Congress in 2000 after decades of oil production north of Poplar left the local aquifer contaminated with carcinogenic compounds and saltier than the sea. Families that drew their water from the area drank bottled water for years until a water line was routed north from Poplar. The tribal seat was hooked into the water network only about a year before a toxic plume reached the town's groundwater. The Fort Peck water treatment plant, the Missouri River water goes through a multi-step process, including chemical treatment, coagulation, flocculation, maturation, sedimentation, clarification, and disinfection. On average, the plant pumps about 3,000 gallons of clean drinking water per minute, but on days when the temperature is over 100 degrees, White Eagle stays as late as 8 p.m., monitoring water use as it rises in order to keep output steady. Her husband brings her supper. When the pipeline breaks, we're dead in the water, White Eagle says. If a pipeline spill shut down the water network, White Eagle says the communities on and around Fort Peck Reservation that rely on it would be without water until they could reconnect to whichever old groundwater systems aren't polluted by the toxic plume. She says Poplar could draw from a backup well to the west of town, but that's their last reserve of clean water. White Eagle says 60 to 80% of the water plant produces goes to the Dry Prairie Rural Water Supply System, an off-reservation partner network that provides water for many of the nearby white communities. Nashville began receiving water from the plant in March, and negotiations are underway to extend the network to Scobie, where, White Eagle says, you can smell hydrogen sulfide, a foul-smelling gas, when you flush the toilet. When the network is complete, it will serve 30,000 people in Northeast Montana. In December 2012, Montana's outgoing Democratic governor, Brian Schweitzer, chaired his final meeting of the Montana Land Board, a panel of the state's top 5 elected officials. The all-Democrat board was voting on selling easements to TransCanada for Keystone XL to cross Montana's rivers, but first had to face public comment. The 4 other officials on the board were Montana's then Attorney General Steve Bullock, now the governor, Secretary of State Linda McCulloch, State Auditor Monica Ledeen, and Superintendent of Public Instruction Denise Juneau, the first Indigenous woman in the country to be elected to a statewide executive position. Critics, including the Montana Environmental Information Center and Northern Plains Resource Council, said it was irresponsible for the board to consider selling the easements before TransCanada had done safety assessments, and premature considering federal approval for the project hadn't yet been granted. When the environmentalists said the board had a responsibility to review the environmental threats posed by Keystone XL, particularly the downstream of the dam spillway, Schweitzer replied that the board merely handled the money and that the Montana Department of Environmental Quality was responsible for environmental concerns. MDEQ had already approved Keystone XL 9 months earlier. MDEQ Director Tom Livers said last year that the threat posed by Keystone XL to the water network was, quote, not identified as an issue during scoping, in public comments, or in the tribal consultation process. The land board voted 5-0 to approve the sale of easements to TransCanada for $741,000 without discussion of the Fort Peck tribe's drinking water. It's not clear why TransCanada's recently published Missouri River safety assessments don't mention the Fort Peck tribe's drinking water. According to the EIS, TransCanada has known for years that the pipeline poses a threat to the reservation. The tribes have sent multiple letters to successive U.S. Secretaries of State, The State Department admitted knowledge of the water intake and network years ago in the pipeline's environmental impact statement, though its knowledge was incomplete. The affected environment section of the environmental impact statement, published in 2014, notes that the Assiniboine and Sioux rural water supply system is 77 miles downriver from the proposed Missouri River crossing and, quote, replaces previous groundwater supplies that are no longer in use, omitting the fact that much of this groundwater was contaminated by oil extraction, necessitating construction of the Assiniboine-Sioux rural water supply system. In the statement's public comment section, the State Department addressed how, quote, potential impacts to tribal surface water systems are assessed, mentioning both the Assiniboine-Sioux rural water supply system and the Minnewaconee rural water supply system downriver on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Quote, the possibility of a spill reaching the intakes for the tribal water systems are exceptionally remote due to the presence of upstream barriers such as dams, as well as downstream distance between proposed project water body crossings and the intakes. The statement reads, while there are multiple dams between Pine Ridge and the proposed pipeline crossing in Montana, there are none between Fort Peck's water intake and the crossing site, and the environmental impact statement doesn't mention any other type of barrier. According to the environmental impact statement's environmental consequences section, spill impacts to the water networks and their intakes could include, quote, the temporary loss of supply during spill response and cleanup. The document also states the possibility of a spill reaching the tribal water network is remote, but the explanation given is that a distance of at least 10 miles downstream from the proposed pipeline was recommended for the identification of sensitive resources that could be affected by a release from the proposed pipeline, and that the tribal water networks are, quote, significantly beyond the proposed project impact assessment buffer. Simply put, the tribe's water supplies are outside of the environmental impact statement's arbitrary 10-mile line, and therefore were not considered threatened, despite the fact that the EIS states in the same paragraph that a pipeline spill could shut them down. Eastern Montana is no stranger to pipelines, spilling oil into sources of drinking water. Another shallow Yellowstone River oil pipeline was cracked open by an ice jam in January 2015, spilling an estimated 30,000 gallons of crude into the river and contaminating the drinking water of some of the 5,000 people in the downriver town of Glendive. The month after the Glendive spill, the Fort Peck Executive Board unanimously passed a resolution opposing construction of the Keystone XL pipeline because of the threat it posed to the water network. When President Barack Obama directed the State Department to reject Keystone XL later that year, the reason given wasn't the threat of spills, but rather that the United States had to take the lead on combating global warming 4 weeks ahead of the Paris Climate Change Conference. When President Donald Trump resurrected the pipeline in 2017, within days of taking office, his decision was based on the same environmental impact statement available to the previous administration. It took environmental and indigenous rights groups only a couple months to put together a lawsuit challenging what they described as Trump's, quote, rubber stamping of the pipeline. That lawsuit was filed in federal court in Montana, the state where the Canadian pipeline enters the United States. Plaintiffs include local environmental groups that warned the Montana Land Board in 2012 about the dam spillway threat and the victims of the 2015 Yellowstone River oil spill. While the Fort Peck Executive Board did not join the lawsuit, Bill Whitehead, chairman of the board that runs the water network, is a named plaintiff, though not in his official capacity. The lawsuit argues that the Trump administration came to completely opposite conclusions using the same data as the Obama administration. Data it says was already biased in favor of the pipeline, ignoring fatal flaws in the environmental assessment, such as the threat posed to the Fort Peck Reservation's water, pallid sturgeon, and endangered whooping crane migratory paths, as well as the pipeline's contribution to climate change. Both parties expect that District Judge Brian Morris will issue a full ruling on the lawsuit by the end of the year. If Morris rules in favor of the plaintiffs and blocks the pipeline, most observers expect the Trump administration to appeal the decision to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. If Morris's decision survives an appeal there, the case would most likely end up in the U.S. Supreme Court, where, as Trans Canada's lead attorney Peter Steenland has pointed out, environmental lawsuits go to die. So shortly after I wrote this story, Judge Brian Morris up in Great Falls, federal judge, he ruled against the Keystone XL pipeline and injuncted construction, so construction was stopped. After that, basically he pulled a key permit that the pipeline needed to be built. That permit was issued by the State Department, and after that happened, the Trump administration kept failing in courts. So they just had Trump use an executive order to rewrite how pipelines are certified. So instead of the State Department issuing the permit, now the president does. So they just threw this one out, the injunction goes away, put a new one in, start construction again. And then Judge Morris injuncted another permit that they needed for water crossings. And then Biden was elected, and he killed it as expected. And now there's weird quasi-fake attempts by Montana's senators in DC to get Biden to just give the permit back and restart construction, which legally would not work because there's this little problem called separation of powers in the United States Constitution. So yeah, questions, comments, anything?
Hunter, that was incredible, man. That like just the volume of stuff that you marshaled in that piece. I mean, could you you know, and like recognizing that the answer to this is probably like, you know, could fill several hours, but do you mind talking just a little bit about your sort of process in terms of like, and maybe sort of going from and like concluding the bulk of the research and sort of moving into the writing of it, or any place along that line that you want to speak to?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of had to come at this at a variety of different angles. On the one side, one of the hardest things you can do, also kind of one of the easiest things you can do as a journalist, is just to read the actual documents. I mean, they're all publicly available. It might be like 3,000 pages or something, but you know, you guys are in an MFA, you know how to read. It's just something that you got to do, like, and nobody actually does it. So you read these documents, you see they're full of contradictory information, you see they're full of outright lies, and then you just put that in the newspaper and things happen. And that's kind of just the essence of what I do. In terms of the actual reporting, I don't actually have a driver's license, I never have, and I don't have a car. So when somebody like me tries to go to like Northeast Montana, it can be kind of difficult. Luckily my photographer drives, and I was actually able to just take an Amtrak from like up in Whitefish, where I have some buddies, all the way out to Fort Peck to meet my photographer colleague and videographer colleague, and we just kind of bummed around from there. I already had some sources on the res that have worked as basically fixers for me and just introducing me to people in the community, kind of letting them know that I'm not some weirdo, or because there's a lot of distrust for press on the reservation, just because typically the only time the reservation makes the news in Montana is when the Billings Gazette or the Great Falls Tribune will write about some horrific crime on the reservation, which they feel gives them just a bad reputation that is undeserved. And so it's about building just trust with these people, showing that you know what you're talking about, you've read the documents, and just, you know, listening and not blowing them off when they tell you these horrific racist stories that do happen. After I wrote this story, I wrote another story. There's reference in this story here to an ACLU lawsuit that got a whole bunch of information about the police's plans for protests and surveillance. I was able to get the ACLU of Montana to give me the entire data dump of what they got from state and federal authorities. And I wrote an investigation on that basically showed the Bullock administration, FEMA, and dozens of different security and police organizations across the state, basically creating a mass surveillance program that also included a riot combat training program that they would put all these rural police forces in eastern Montana on the pipeline route through. So they teach them how to beat people up, and they teach them how to spy on people. And yeah, I don't recall where I was going with this, but that's nuts.
Yeah. Well, and this it's kind of leading into this, but we had somebody reach out to me in the chat asking just sort of like, now that the pipeline's dead, like, are you sort of still following that? It sounds like there's still lots to follow on that beat, but sort of, is that where the bulk of your attention is, or what are you sort of working on now?
I've got, you know, a lot of plates spinning here and there. There is still stuff to cover with Keystone. I'm working on a piece for Counterpunch right now. kind of trying to contextualize the fight for water all the way back to the foundation of the reservation, because when the reservation was founded, it had no water. All the buffalo were dead. Everybody on the reservation was starving to death. And one of the many lawsuits filed against Keystone XL was filed by the Fort Belknap Reservation, which is nearby to Fort Peck. And that lawsuit is based off of an old treaty lawsuit from the early 1900s that established the, not the drinking water network, but the irrigation network that allowed crops to actually be grown in this desert and allowed the people of these reservations to actually survive and stop starving to death. So that's kind of more the angle I'm looking into right now. And then another project I'm working on right now involves reading a shitload of these books about Nazis and investigation into the Montana ruling class's collaboration with Nazi Germany before and during World War II, and how they whitewashed that legacy, how they got away with it, how they just established all these different foundations and newspapers and think tanks to just kind of like put out propaganda for decades about how like this wasn't anti-Semitic. What are you talking about? Whereas the reality is much, much darker. So yeah, that's stuff I'm working on right now. If you follow my Twitter, you'll just see me reporting on random stuff every once in a while. Like I did some dark money reporting yesterday, just while I was laying in bed. It's really not that hard. And yeah, all sorts of stuff, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much, man. I mean, it's fascinating and horrifying, but awesome to sort of hear you share it and hear what you're working on now. I think I'm gonna I want to throw sort of a related just sort of a composition question to Connor real quick. Just given that Connor, you like the piece that you were sharing also sort of like, I don't know, it always seemed to me like it had a lot of parts that you were interested in, but probably not much of what you might call like a more conventional plot, or like that sort of a more like action oriented thing wasn't going to be appropriate to sort of explore that. So if you want to talk just briefly about sort of the composition process for your piece, I think that'd be a sweet companion.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an amazing answer, just because I think one thing you've heard me talk about a lot is that I don't think I'm very good at short stories generally. I really like sort of expansive journeys for characters where you get to go through a lot of, sort of different internal anecdotes, sort of mini sagas within a longer arc. And so the way the story came about was I wanted to write about robots kind of in an abstract way. And I was like, all right, I have to put these robots in like a somewhat more static situation to sort of manage that conceit in like 20 pages. And so I was like, all right, I'm imagining a ruin in the future. That's the atrium that they're in. It's on an estuary. So that imagery comes to me and I'm like, well, wait, what if one of the robots was dead? Like, what does robot grieving look like? And I think that like, for me, I just want to, because I want to put characters in motion over over tens of thousands of words usually. I think that the only trick that I have for short story writing is just trying to figure out a relatively contained, static enough situation that's going to let me conjure what I want to conjure. And I think if you can do that, you have a lot of freedom to play with a short story. But that's the hard part for me, is like containing the characters in the right way.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, I've forgotten. I love so much the like the snail, the repeating snail motif in that bit. So yeah, that was fantastic to hear it again, and love the piece. I want as tends to happen, I forget that I open it up to other people's questions and just make it Sam Q&A segment. But Daniela had another great question for Hunter. Specifically about Azur, who's against the pipeline, but not a stereotypical lefty environmentalist. And she's wondering, in a longer piece with so much focus on documenting and data, how do you balance straight up information with characterization?
So I've done my share of profile writing work. I know how to do it, but it's definitely not my preferred type of journalism. It's something that you see people do a lot, and I think it can be kind of low-hanging fruit at times. The number of like very simple sports profiles you'll see as cover stories, I find a bit boring. But for me, it's all about what do these characters represent in the context of this story. I'm not including random people in here. I'm including people that have power, people who are attempting to have power. And what my reporting really focuses on more than anything are the relationships of power. How do things actually work? I'm a materialist, so when I'm seeking out sources, I'm seeking out people affected by power, and I'm seeking out people who are applying power. And I am playing with that dynamic and, you know, paralleling that with the information that we need to properly contextualize these relationships. So for me, it's not necessarily just writing about somebody for the purpose of writing about them. It's what do they represent, and what is the role that they are playing here.
Cool. Yeah, that stood out to me too. I mean, there's so many personalities in that piece that feel like they could be their like their own, I would read reams just on who they are and how they sort of live. So that's a fascinating like sort of organizing principle.
Yeah,
cool.
I mean, it's like, and these people, they've kept going from where they started here. I mean, Chairman Azur, he had a reputation as a bit of a dictator. You see this on a lot of reservations. There's a lot of, I guess you could call it, federal pro-democracy law that does just not apply on reservations due to tribal sovereignty. But he was recently removed by the rest of the executive board for a corruption scandal. He also created basically during like the big rodeo celebration every year, he had the police round up all of like the addicts and the drunks in town and basically put them in like an outdoor concentration camp. Then you've got people like Lance Fortstar here. Again, he's still very pro-Democrat, and he's been put on basically an advisory board for the Montana Democratic Party. I don't think that's gonna, I don't know what's gonna come of that. I mean, I don't think the Democratic Party is gonna listen to this native advisory board when they say don't build these pipelines, just because the moneyed interests are more important. So yeah, I mean, this story keeps going and keeps going in wild directions. So
cool. Well, yeah, thanks so much for sharing it. I'll leave another 2 beats for anybody that has final questions for Connor or Hunter. Anything that you're burning to ask before we wrap up. But I also know it's Sunday night. It's getting into the later portion of the evening, so I don't want to keep people too long. So yeah, so I guess with that, we'll close it out. Thanks so much to both of you. This was an awesome reading. Oh wait, hold on. I'm getting a private question. Hold on. This is for Connor. I think this will be a good closeout for us. Somebody's wondering just that they want to know just a little bit about how you think about the science fiction mode, the literary fiction mode, because there are elements of both that in what you shared this evening. And so if you've got any thoughts on that to take us home, people want to hear.
That's good, because I'm kind of on hiatus from it right now, but I, for 2 years, helped run a science fiction and fantasy focused podcast, and I thought a lot about that question about sort of how genres interconnect. And I'll say something fairly blunt that I think is kind of key to understanding this. I think one of the biggest reasons that there isn't more like sci-fi and fantasy interpenetration into literary fiction is simply that, and I hate that this is true, but it is true, very few of those writers are particularly good at writing. And I don't want to say that I'm like, that can sound really arrogant, but I think that like what I want to see happen is just the really intensive tools we do in like literary fiction world, especially in MFAs, where we really ask hard questions about our prose, and especially about the ways that our prose relates to character. and how much like emotional intensity we're bringing out, how elegantly we're doing it, having to really like pull stuff deeply from characters in our writing. I think that like a lot of the future of written fiction is going to be applying those really rigorous tools to scenarios we now kind of bracket as fantasy and sci-fi. I think it's hard, but I think that like done well, and there are examples of it already, done well, I think it's some of the best fiction there is.
Awesome. I think that's a great future forward note to close this out on. So I just want to thank everyone again for sticking around with us this evening and hanging out. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Yeah, look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, Hunter and Connor, and have a great night, everybody.